Hi there, welcome to Chapter 3. This is Lecture 3 as well. We're skipping Chapter 2 as we want to cover it later on in the semester when it's more appropriate for the assignment number 3 project that you're going to complete. So, Chapter 3 is all about computer hardware. This is some of the fun stuff. So, to help us understand that, we need to understand where we came from. So one of the things that we're going to discuss in Chapter 3 is the history and the evolution of computer hardware. These are the computers, the systems of where we started back in the 50s and 60s and where we've gotten through to today. Then we're going to identify some of the components of computer systems so that you have an understanding of exactly, not exactly how they operate, but a little bit about what makes a computer and how it interfaces with you and why it's important for you to know some of these things. As stated before, all computers are systems of input, processing, storage, output, and control. In the basic elements, it comes down to that basic system: input, processing, and output. Computers started off a long time ago, actually, and some of these other elements could not have, computers could not have existed without them. So some of the very first calculators were us manually counting on our fingers and toes, or chicken bones, or shells, or rocks, or marbles. Then we went from calculate from the word calculus, meaning small stone. Then in 1642, Blaise Pascal invented the first mechanical adding machine. Here's what his adding machine looked like. It was a form of gears and levers that were manipulated to calculate numbers. In 1801, Joseph Jacquard created a loom, very much like a fabric loom, and programmed it very similar using paper cards to produce different patterns. Then Herman Hollerith in 1880 was asked to conduct a census for the United States government. That company, the company that he formed in order to do that, was later merged with a company that then became International Business Machines, or IBM, one of the largest computer manufacturers in the world. Then in 1946, the ENIAC, or Electronic Numerical Integrator and Calculator, was the very first electronic or digital computer. This is very important. There was a computer developed in 1944, probably 43 to 44, called Enigma. Enigma was a mechanical computer that was developed by Alan Turing. You might have seen that in the movie The Imitation Game, which was very popular in 2013, 2014, I believe. Here's a look at Jacquard's loom. This is a representation of the Herman Hollerith card, or punch card. Each card represents a character, so that sequence of little dots there comes out to one character in a modern computer. That might be the character A, for example. This is the inside of what the ENIAC must have looked like. It was composed of vacuum tubes. The gentleman that you see there leaning down to take a look at those tubes are actually almost like light bulbs. They glow red, they become very hot. In fact, the cooling and air conditioning system for this, in fact it wasn't air conditioning because this predates air conditioning. So to cool these rooms, they had big devices called chillers, and the chillers were huge, usually block-long buildings where water would run through wooden slats with air running through it, and that air was then pumped into the rooms to try and cool it. The water, of course, had to be very cold for them to do that. The other notable aspect of vacuum tube computers was If one tube went out, the whole computer malfunctioned or would not operate correctly. And unfortunately, there were no diagnostic tools to help them find that tube that had malfunctioned. Very tedious. For that reason, many of the early computers that utilized vacuum tubes were non-operational more than they were operational because of the delicate nature of the tubes. In the 1950s, transistors replaced the vacuum tubes. This was critical. In 1958, integrated circuit chips were invented that were multiple transistors on a circuit card. This became huge. Then in the 70s and 80s, there was further miniaturization of these circuits. Then in 1980, the Altair 8080 was the first programmable microcomputer. This was the first computer that could sit in a room that wasn't temperature controlled and wasn't huge. It was called a microcomputer, but as you'll see, it really wasn't that small. And then in the 1990s, Apple Computer and the IBM PC revolutionized end-user computing. This is a picture of the Altair 8800, the very first microcomputer. This picture came from Cal Poly Pomona. Similar to the Altair was the Bendix G15. This picture comes to us courtesy of Berkeley, California. And here's a comparison between a vacuum tube and a transistor. Now they're not to scale, but you can see the vacuum tubes in the upper left-hand quadrant of this slide are actually as large as incandescent light bulbs. And so the scale is quite off. They're quite large. And then these transistors are the size of the little pinky on your finger, the little finger. They're very small. These are very large for transistors. Now they're much, much smaller than that. But that's the comparison in the time frame that the vacuum tubes were still in existence. Now these are integrated circuits which are composed of hundreds, if not thousands, of little transistors on them. The Intel 4004 microprocessor was not only just transistors, but a true microprocessor that operated on its own, revolutionizing the computing world. This is a microscopic view inside the Intel 4004 microprocessor. Those little pathways in the middle are the transistors and the gateways that allow electrons to flow back and forth. Computers come in a variety of sizes, shapes, and capabilities. We designate them into three primary classifications: mainframes, midrange, which are almost obsolete now. We would probably call those now servers, and then microcomputers. In the mid-range of computers this was called a MiniComputer, which is really in the mid-range. A PDP-8 in 1965 was the chief scientific computing computer used for engineering in the aerospace industry. This picture comes to us courtesy of General Dynamics Pomona Division. To put this into scale, look at the people in this picture on this MiniComputer, a PDP-11. This was also a scientific computing machine. It ran a software called Fortran. You'll notice the chair and the console on the person sitting down. Most mini-computers and all mainframe computers have an operator that's dedicated to that computer. If that computer is running 24 hours a day, it must have an operator sitting there 24 hours a day minding the computer. One of the very first portable computers was the TRS-80. TRS stands for Radio Shack. Tandy Radio Shack. That's the TRS. This model sold for $599 in 1979. This was revolutionary. For many, this was, including myself, this was my very first computer. It was also called the Trash 80. Lovingly. That was a nice name for it. Another famous microcomputer was the Commodore 64. It was revolutionary because it was one of the first computers used in businesses, but it was a little bit limited. It also was one of the first gaming computers as well. The IBM PC-XT, produced in 1983, revolutionized business computing. This was the very first computer that could sit on a desk in a business setting and link to the IBM mainframes and mid-range computers back in the server room or the data centers. This computer was phenomenal. For many of us, this was our very first business computer. At home, the Apple IIe became a work engine for home computing. It was easy to use. You can see in the middle of the slot, there's two slots there for floppy diskettes. On the left-hand slot, you would put, or drive, you would put a floppy diskette with the software that you wanted to run. The slot or the floppy drive on the right then would contain your data diskette. So you would use both of those drives as you operated this computer. The Apple IIe revolutionized computing as well. Look at the price tag though. It's a little bit more expensive than some of the other computers at $1,300. Then the Apple Lisa came along. Look at that price tag, close to $10,000. This is the first truly graphical user interface. You'll notice the screen looks totally different. It is still slightly monochrome, where all of the computers before this were called green screens. They had two colors. It was green, dark green, and white lettering. That's it. The Lisa brought out both a graphical user interface, but also different types of fonts. This was Steve Jobs' first entry into a graphical user interface, and you'll notice down in the bottom below the keyboard is a mouse. Yay! Finally, we have mouse capability. In 1984, Apple produced the Macintosh. This was revolutionary, and you might have seen playbacks of the commercial of 1984 at the Super Bowl when the Mac was introduced. And the tagline on the commercial is, 1984 is not like 1884, Joseph Orwell's 1884 of Big Brother. And the commercial depicts a young lady with a big sledgehammer running into a movie theater with all these people that seem to be hypnotized in this gray screen of a talking head, and she swings the sledgehammer to destroy the screen, indicating no more Big Brother. Now you have computing at your fingertips. Macintosh also produced the very first talking computer. This was revolutionized at Comdex, where they displayed that capability, and it literally blew away all of the competition. It was pretty fantastic. The IBM PC 3270 was also a revolutionary computer because this actually allowed the same type of software that ran in the big mainframe and mid-range computers back in the data centers to now run on the client desktop. This was a computer that I had in aerospace industry and allowed me connect directly to the accounting, scheduling, and planning and control systems that ran on the big mainframes at the back end. Revolutionary. It changed our lives. It changed the way that we worked. It made us much more efficient and effective in our jobs. It was fantastic. This was one of the very first portable computers. This was called the Compaq, and we lovingly called it the Luggable. It's a luggable because it came with its own set of wheels and cart. It weighed close to 25 to 30 pounds. The other notable, which you cannot see in this picture, but to the right of the display, is a floppy disk drive. But this disk drive was 7-inch floppy diskettes, not the 5 1/4 inch that were used on the Apple IIe and also the IBM models. So this was quite unique. This happens to be a picture of my best friend's computer who worked for Arthur Andersen, the accounting firm. This was the computer that he was given when he got his first job there right out of Cal Poly Pomona. This is a picture of my very first laptop, the Toshiba laptop, in 1988, and I traveled the world using this laptop. Remember, in 1988, this is before the internet, so we communicated back to Mainframe, Midrange, and other computers using telephone wires. So this computer had what's called a modem, where you could connect the telephone cable from the wall jack into this computer, and it would act, you'd have to dial a sequence of numbers just like a telephone number to reach another computer that had a modem on the other side so that you can communicate back and forth to one another. This was not a very light computer. The adapter that sits on the right, I made sure that I took a picture of that adapter because the adapter, the power adapter itself, weighs close to 5 pounds because it had to compensate for both U.S. electricity and international electricity. Most countries outside the United States use 220 volts, while here in the United States we use 110, 120. So we had to have a special power adapter to be able to use in both locations. Quite heavy. And this was a Toshiba Portable, came out a year later after the previous one, that also had somewhat of a color display. You'll notice it's a little orangish screen. That's because the picture didn't take the colors very well. But this was the first color display. In 1993, Apple came out with a handheld device called the Newton. I'll show you a picture later that compares the size of the Newton to the iPhone. The Newton was considered a failure. The consumer market was not ready for it. It had a limited set of applications as well. It was called a Personal Information Manager, or a PIM. It had a calendar, it had a task list, but you couldn't get email and no texting. Remember, internet was in its infancy and we hadn't gotten to that point yet. This is a picture of Apple's first laptop, 1995. It cost $3,300, which was incredible because you could get an Toshiba laptop. Dell wasn't around quite yet, I don't think, and those laptops were under $1,000. So $3,300 was a lot. I was out looking on eBay and I could get it for 20 bucks. It's now an antique collector's item. Here's a comparison of the Newton on the left and an iPhone on the right. You'll see that the Newton, even though it was a handheld, was quite large. That's probably why it wasn't as successful. Its form factor was a little too large because we hadn't gotten to the miniaturization that we are with the iPhone today. Even within the microcomputer system category, there are subcategories underneath them as well. Some are called workstations, which you will find in engineering, but also in media production areas. So workstation video editing consoles are typically large, powerful workstations. Then there's network servers. The whole internet runs on network servers around data centers around the world. And then there's still some computer terminals, which are devices that connect to computers where the computing is done away from the computer, the terminal that you're using. Actually, all of the classrooms in APU are basically just computer terminals. All the software, everything running from in the data center, and the classroom computer is just connecting and developing a relationship with that server in the data center to do all the compute and storage. Here's a Hewlett-Packard Z840 workstation. This is a video editing workstation that was used in the production of the latest Shrek movie, and I believe it was produced by Pixar. Entertainment industry users are starting to move from Apple computers over to the Hewlett-Packard Z840 workstation, as these computers are highly scalable and have a tremendous amount of power at much more affordable pricing. And the software that it utilizes is far more sophisticated than the Apple software that has been a little bit diminished over years. Here's the inside of the HP Z840, and the reason why it is becoming so popular, because everything is modularized. You can see that there's two pop-outs there. Those pop-outs allow users to add more processing, more storage, better graphic cards, or more memory to the graphics card so they can do more sophisticated functions. Another brand of microcomputer systems are the network computers. These are designed specifically to be used for networks, so they don't necessarily have a lot of processing power or high storage. The primary purpose is to allow information to flow through them quickly and effectively. Then we have information appliances that are also web enabled, so that they're processing these are the cell phones, PDAs, other handheld devices that allow us to use PC or personal computer type devices in smaller form factors. This is a collection of computers in a data center, and they look pretty much like just normal desktop computers. Actually, this is pretty much what APU's data center looked like in the year 2000. This is a picture of APU employees pushing a Hewlett-Packard rack up the dock on its way to the data center. This is what that rack looked like when it's fully populated. On the left-hand side, you'll see vertical stripes going up and down. Those vertical stripes or components there are actually servers. In this particular configuration, you'll see 4 rows on the left-hand side. Each row contains 9 servers. So this configuration allows us 36 servers in one rack. You'll notice on the right-hand rack, the big block up at the top is actually a battery system. All of our computers in data centers are actually run off of batteries. We then have electricity that charges the batteries on a consistent basis. That way, if we ever lose utility power, or the electricity come from the Southern California Edison, or in our case, Azusa Light and Power, our computing system will continue to work as they'll run off the batteries. On the lower portion of this rack, you will notice that there are 15 devices, and there's 5 rows of those devices. Those little devices are hard disks. That area down below the big block is called a storage area network, or SAN. You'll notice that some of them are colored lighter green and kind of a beige color, while others are dark. That's because some of those disks are extremely important. They have importance because they can hold the master information and addresses where information is spread across the hard disks. That allows that if one of those hard disks goes bad, we can pull it out without impacting the data, the accuracy of the data or the integrity of the data. Everything will continue to work. This type of a technology is called RAID. This happens to be called RAID level 5 because you'll see that on the lower portion of this rack, there's 5 of those light colored with green light hard disks. This is the back end of one of those racks. You'll notice the little red loop there. That red loop is to protect people from putting their hands into that fan. That fan is operating at the same speed that jet engines are operating at. And in fact, this happens to be Hewlett-Packard fans. These have a special patent using what's called the Venturi effect, which is the same effect that jets use. The whole purpose for these fans is to get heat away from the internal components, the transistors, the circuit cards, the processors within the computer. They generate a tremendous amount of heat. We need to get that heat away, so we have these very high-powered fans. You'll notice that all of these, there's 2 of everything. That redundancy allows us, so if one component fails, the other component will pick up the load. All computer systems and data centers have this level of redundancy, and now even Apple and HP products on the laptop are coming with that type of redundancy as well. You have to pay a little bit more for it, but it'll make sure that your computer will always be running. And here's just another back-end view of a set of servers in our data center. This is called a co-location building. This one happens to be down in the City of Industry, and you'll notice the red signs at the top with white letterings. You'll see that this is row 147. This means that there are 147 rows of these computers. These happen to be mid-range level computers that are owned by other companies but have been placed here so that they will be in operation if something happens to their primary data center. So these are backup redundant systems that are operating. This is critical. You will remember 9/11. When the Twin Towers fell, there were multiple businesses, many businesses in there. Many of the businesses that were in the Twin Towers went out of business because they did not utilize a co-location for either their processing or their data. And because they did not have backups and they didn't have the redundancy that a co-location provides, they went out of business. American Express had one of their major processing facilities in one of the Twin Towers. Within 2 hours, American Express was operating at full capacity out of their co-locations, one in Florida and one in Colorado. They were not impacted as greatly by the 9/11 incident as other companies were. As stated, there's mid-range, mainframe, and then I want to add the other type of computer, which is called a supercomputer. Supercomputers, or the next wave of computing, also are including what are called distributed or grid computing, which is parallel computing over a network. This utilizes multiple computers at various different locations that are networked together, and work is processed and distributed out to those different computers in different locations. Here's an example of a mainframe computer from way back in the 1960s. This happened to be a Xerox computer, the same type of computer system that was used at Mount San Antonio College in Walnut, California. This is a CDC Cyber mainframe computer that was used at Cal Poly Pomona. And this is the IBM System 34. The IBM System 34 was a mainframe computer that revolutionized business. It came preloaded with accounting software and other types of business software. You'll also notice that this had a computer operator that's sitting over there in the chair on the right-hand side of your slide. This is going a little bit further back, but this is a card punch reader and puncher. This is a device that allowed us to use the Herman Hollerith cards to punch in instructions. A typical set of instructions, for example, programming one of the very first programs that I wrote for a mainframe computer that required that I print out the words "Hello, Jeff" onto and printed output required a shoebox full of Herman Hollerith cards just to give the instructions to say "Hello, Jeff." Wow. Here's another look at that IBM punch card. This is a mainframe green screen terminal. You can see the green screen, the green lettering there. These are character graphics on a green screen terminal. That is all using different characters to form a picture. This is the Cray 2 supercomputer. For many years, this was the fastest computer on the planet Earth. It is 6 feet tall, which you can't see from this picture, and it is cooled with liquid nitrogen running through and between the circuit cards. This particular computer was at the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory up in Central California, in the Bay Area. Most recently, the IBM Sequoia has been one of the fastest supercomputers in the world. You'll notice that it just looks like some of the racks in our server room. This is the Titan Cray XK7 supercomputer, which held the title as fastest computer in the world until it was outpaced by the Chinese. This is the Milky Way too. I cannot pronounce the Chinese definition of it, but this is a supercomputer that the Chinese built, and it currently has the distinction of being the fastest supercomputer in the world. So, as kind of a review, just to understand a computer system, it's comprised of input, processing, and output, but there's a whole lot more to it than that as well. We have storage and we have control, just as a reminder. And here's a technical depiction of how those all work together. We've seen this before, so not too earth-shattering. Now, in order for us to measure the speeds of some of these supercomputers, we have to use a different type of algorithm or measurement system. So we typically use millions of instructions per second. This is based upon an agreed upon international formula, a mathematical operation that measures the speed of computers. Millions of instructions per second has actually been replaced. That's kind of the 1980s, 90s term. And in the 2000s, we started using teraflops, which is trillion of floating point operations per second. If you have any math background, you'll know that floating point operations consume a lot of computing power. And so by doing trillions of those floating point operations within a second, we can identify how fast a computer is. And now we come to the meat of this chapter, which is Moore's Law. Moore's Law is really important for us because it identifies that the number of transistors on a chip will double every 18 to 40 months. More broadly, we identified that the power, speed, and capacity of a computer will also double every 18 to 24 months. Actually, that's what's going to be on the quiz. But in actuality, Moore's Law has shrunk a bit. And now we're seeing a doubling of capacity, power, and speed almost every 9 to 13 months instead of the 18 to 24 months. So it's getting faster and faster and faster, but we're running into one big problem, the law of physics. Electrons can only go so fast. That's why we're moving into two other general directions. The one direction is light source, and the second is biological source.